This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. In this episode, I speak to Lucy Adlington, author of 4 Red Sweaters, Powerful True Stories of Women and the Holocaust. Jock Heidenstein, Anita Lasker, Chana Zumerkorn, Regina Feldman. What did these young women have in common? They didn't know each other. They never met, not before or after their respective experiences with the Holocaust. But something connecting their stories in this book by novelist and clothes historian Lucy Adlington is a red sweater. A sweater. That might seem like a mundane, ordinary thing. But the red sweater for Jock, Anita, Chana, and Regina in the context of the Holocaust became something significant. It held memories of a loving mother. It connected sisters to each other. It connected a sister and a brother, too. It was protection from bitter cold in inhospitable places. It was a hidden layer, and later, something exhibited for all to see, to understand, remember, and never forget what occurred during part of the persecution of European Jews that occurred during World War II, from Kindertransports and ghettos to the pogroms of Kristallnacht, the killing centers of death camps of Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, the Sobibor extermination camp. From Lucy Adlington, author of the acclaimed The Dressmakers of Auschwitz, 4 Red Sweaters immortalizes the young women and their families. Their resilience, strength, and generosity accompanied them in these very darkest of events of human history. Here now my conversation with Lucy Adlington about 4 Red Sweaters, Powerful True Stories of Women and the Holocaust. So I think readers of your book, The Dressmakers of Auschwitz, know about your work as a clothes historian. But where did the idea for this book come from?
I think it actually came through the research for The Dressmakers of Auschwitz. Clothes history is my thing, so I'm always on the lookout for fascinating stories of women and textiles, you know, the making, the wearing, the passing on of memories through clothes. And while I was researching to write about the fashion salon in Auschwitz, I did keep noticing lots of details about knitting. And these were, you know, prisoners who were knitting to stay alive, in as much as, you know, there was one woman called Ella who was knitting for the commandant's family when they had a new baby. And it really struck me how poignant that was, that this young Jewish prisoner had been cut off from her family. And here she was in hell, knitting beautiful baby clothes. And so from there, I kept looking more and more into knitting. And I'd long been, I suppose, fascinated by the way that, I mean, I'm from England, so we tend to wear a lot of woolly clothes, a lot of sweaters, you know, warm clothes. And I'm fascinated by how they're so everyday and we take them for granted, but they actually hold a lot of emotional memories. So it got me thinking about my grandmother, who did all the knitting in my family. You know, she would knit us sweaters and gloves and everything, and we just took it for granted. And I began thinking about all those lovely intergenerational connections, and that's when I stumbled on a little red jumper in a museum collection, and that's when I thought, oh, there is a story here. So that's how it started.
And there wasn't just one story, right? But I want to ask you, what is it about a red sweater that made it not ubiquitous, but kind of, I mean, at least recurring and probably resonant among girls and young women, I mean, even today? What do you think it is about a red sweater?
With the color just pops, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think that's what caught my attention when I was browsing various, online archives. I was looking through my own collection. I have a pretty extensive collection of garments spanning, 250 years. And there's something about red that, yes, it can mean danger, or stop, in our culture. But red is also a really vivid color, a very enlivening color. And yeah, I've begun sort of collecting my own red sweaters, and not all of them have stories, but I really love the way when you wear red, you do feel, I don't know, it makes me feel a little bit more sassy, a little bit more powerful. And there is one theory that in European culture, that red traditionally has meant a color of protection. So maybe 100, 200 years ago, red was something that would keep, evil spirits away, if you're going to think of it in those folklore terms. And so when I spotted a little red sweater in the collection of the Imperial War Museum in London, and as I began diving into the story and finding out more, I thought very much about that idea of protection, because it had belonged to a little girl who essentially had to leave the protection of her family. As a Jewish girl, her family were being harassed in Nazi Germany. Her parents wanted her to get to a safer place as a refugee, and it was so hard to find anywhere that would accept refugees, even children. And so this little girl, her name was Jock Heidenstein, she traveled with this red jumper, this red sweater. And I like to think that she was sort of taking her mother's love with her as protection.
That's so beautiful. I love Jock's story in your book, and Jock's sisters, Rita and Stella. Jock was only 12 in 1938. Can you tell us a little bit about Jock's red sweater?
It's a lovely little sweater. And the original in the museum, of course, is, over time, wool doesn't survive so well. It has been nibbled on by moth larvae. The buttons are cracked, and Jock has clearly grown with this sweater through the war years when she was a refugee in England. And so it's stretched, it's been washed too much. And that tells a story all of itself. But what was particularly poignant was as I began to find out more and more about Jock's family, and they were essentially just a wonderfully ordinary family, just a family in Berlin, Orthodox Jewish family, 3 girls, 3 boys, and all 3 of the girls had a red sweater exactly the same. Their mother bought them 3 identical sweaters, and all 3 girls managed to get a place on the famous Kindertransports, the refugee initiatives for children getting out of fascist Europe, essentially. And so thinking of Jock, Rita, and Stella, all with a little red sweater, is wonderful. And of course, the story, this history, it's not all joyful, but I was so pleased exploring, finding out more about the lives of these 3 sisters in England, where they went to school, what families they stayed with, how they adapted to being refugees in a new country. And they're all so charming, they're so adorable. And then in a very bittersweet way, following their lives through tiny clues, sometimes just little references here and there and the odd picture, but there were also fragments of correspondence, letters between the girls and letters from their mother in Berlin. And unfortunately, in 1941, the letters from Berlin stopped. They had no further news of their family until the end of the war. And, Stella and Rita, they didn't keep their little red sweaters, but Jock did. For the rest of her life, she kept it tucked away until just before her death. It was donated to a museum. So never talked about her story herself. She was very private in her own life. Jock let the sweater speak for her. And that's really what I've tried to do in this book, is let this lovely, lovely garment tell Jock's story and the story of others like her.
This idea that they were just an ordinary family, but they were thrust into this extraordinary situation. Just the mere fact that the 3 sisters were able to be part of that Kindertransport, I think, is kind of miraculous. And I feel like this is something that your book achieves, this idea of humanizing history. These were not just nobodies in the abstract, and you really concretize the idea of their humanity. And it's something that I really appreciate about your work. There was another red sweater, and I'm thinking about Anita Lasker, who was a cellist. Can you tell us a little bit about Anita?
So Anita Lasker grew up, she's a German Jewish girl growing up in Breslau, and a very talented musician from a family who loved music and loved coffee and cake as well, according to Anita's autobiography. And it was hoped that Anita and her sisters could come to England as refugees on the Kindertransport, but there just weren't enough places. So in contrast to Jock, I wanted to follow Anita's story and see, well, what happens if you don't find a safe haven? What happens if all the doors are shut? And so Anita is still alive. She's now Anita Lasker. She's 99 and a force to be reckoned with. What was remarkable for Anita's story, it's quite a well-known story, as it should be, is that she arrived in Auschwitz and happened to mention that she was a cellist, and another prisoner said, "Oh, we need a cellist," which is the most, it's just almost unbelievable, isn't it? How could you need a cellist in Auschwitz-Birkenau? But many people will know that there were orchestras in the men's and women's camps at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and so Anita was taken on as a cellist in the women's orchestra, which, rather like the seamstresses in the fashion salon at Auschwitz, this privileged position gave Anita a chance to survive. She wasn't, as she put it, just in the grey, nameless masses. She had a role, and she was necessary for the SS. They wanted this entertainment. And so Anita's musical career has been, celebrated a lot, as it should be. But I was really struck by a garment that survives from Anita's time in Auschwitz, and it is a little red sweater. And it's Angora. It must be super soft. Angora from Angora rabbits. The yarn is wonderfully soft. And she actually traded a piece of bread, very precious bread, to get hold of this sweater because it was freezing. It was so cold, in winter for these prisoners. And so I just love to think of her having this bold red color, but also this super soft sweater underneath her uniform as she played. And it also linked with a very fascinating element of SS history. Heinrich Himmler being absolutely passionate about the breeding of Angora rabbits. And so there are 3,000 Angora bunny rabbits at Auschwitz being looked after better than the prisoners. So Anita's story, it really highlights so much about this surreal world created by the SS, but also that enduring human power of resilience and survival. And her sweater is now on display in London, and she was very emphatic, Anita was, that it should be displayed with the holes showing, when this fragile jumper it wore through, and with the darning on it. It's darned with yellow yarn. And she wore it all the way through her time in the camps and afterwards at Bergen-Belsen, rebuilding her life. So it's a very special garment.
It's incredible. So she played for time, and in other ways, Regina Feldman and Chana Zumerkorn played with time in another way, or extended their time in another way, because they had skills as seamstresses, as knitters. Can you talk about Chana?
Chana Zumerkorn is one of those people who would perhaps be forgotten completely from memory once her relatives have gone, or anyone who knew her, because she was another just wonderfully ordinary person. There is very little chance of finding out much about her now. She was one of innumerable people who were murdered and whose existence was meant to be eradicated by the Nazis. She grew up in the city of Łódź which became part of occupied Poland when the Nazis invaded. And she was able to survive for a while because she was a knitter. And the Germans were very busy exploiting Jewish labor in the city in ghetto conditions. The Jewish workers were crafting the most beautiful garments, both stitching and knitting and weaving, leatherwork, millinery, for the Germans. And I found it so incredibly moving that Hannah, although she must have been in such, dire straits herself, cold, hungry, anxious, very stressful situation, she was making wonderful knitted garments. But the reason I wrote about her is because I think even, more particularly people who didn't survive, and we need to know their stories too. And she had a wonderful red sweater, which in November 1939, she gifted to her brother, Joseph. And Joseph was attempting to flee the German occupation to go for safety in Russia. And Hannah gifted him her jumper saying, "I think you will need this." And it represents such an act of love and generosity. And Joseph kept that sweater for 70 years, long after he knew that his family had been murdered. So a wonderful testimony to a woman who would have been anonymous, but the sweater survives.
There's so much poignancy in this book, and this is an example of that. The story about the brother Joseph being so cold and the sister giving him the sweater, and that red sweater then going on 70 years later when he basically can share this particular anecdote about how she shared the red sweater with him in this complete act of generosity and love. And I'm thinking, too, about Regina Feldman, another expert knitter. And so she sort of was kept alive because of these skills that she had. Can you talk about Regina? And the other thing about Regina is that she has a connection to Sobibor.
Yeah, and I should imagine that for many people who would be familiar with the history of Auschwitz as a camp and as an extermination center, they maybe haven't heard of Sobibor, which was purely a death camp. It existed only to commit genocide, and it was overwhelmingly of Jewish people. And Regina was another ordinary girl, another ordinary Jewish girl living in Poland with her family. And she should have been, she should never have been in history almost. She should have been quietly going about her life. But when the Nazis invaded, it was a very familiar story of her family being persecuted, put into forced labor, and eventually they were taken, her whole family were taken in December 1942 to Sobibor, which was this secret place in the forest. And it was a really cold winter when they arrived. And an SS man stepped out in front of these new arrivals and asked, "Who can knit?" And that to me is just such a staggeringly banal question. I would say most of the girls and women in that group would have been able to knit. It was a very everyday skill. And Regina's mother, and I don't know whether it was from her daughter forward and said, "Go on, you can knit, volunteer." And that literally saved Regina's life, because along with a group of 12 girls were all put in a hut and told to knit socks for the German army. And that's what they had to do, a sock a day. And that kept her alive. And she soon found out the reality of Sobibor and what happened to everybody else who came there. And it was actually, Regina wasn't only knitting socks, she was told by an SS man to knit a red jumper. So that for me was where the connection came in. And this was not a jumper that Regina was, her mother hadn't given it to her out of love, like Jock Heidenstein, or it wasn't a gift like Hannah's gift to her brother Joseph. It wasn't even something that she'd managed to get for herself to keep warm like Anita. This jumper she was having to knit for a perpetrator, for a man who brutalized and who murdered. But while she was knitting it, and you know how it is when people are knitting, they just sit there quietly and people overlook them, but they're there, they're knitting, they're listening, they're watching. While she was knitting this red sweater, Regina was able to look through a certain window, she was tucked away, and she was able to bear witness to the genocide, to the queues of people going to the gas chambers in Sobibor. And so she bore witness. And the reason she could even do that, not only was it because she was knitting to stay alive, is because she was part of this most extraordinary armed uprising at the camp, in which half of the prisoners who were laboring in the camp for the SS managed to escape despite machine guns, despite electric fences, despite mines. There was a huge uprising. They thought they had nothing to lose. And it was incredibly exhilarating to read about Regina and her friends, these other girls, running for their lives through a minefield, just desperate to be free. And so she lived to bear witness, even though who knows what happened to that little red sweater that she was making, or indeed to the man who told her to make it.
It's such an incredible story because so many people died in that escape, trying to escape, and not many survived and were able to go on and tell the world about Sobibor and the things that went on there. It's really something.
And it's so important, isn't it, to keep the fragments, whatever memories there are, whatever testimonies there are, we have to keep alert to them, to keep sharing them, to keep teaching new generations, because otherwise the incredible courage and the resistance of those inmates in Sobibor would not be known, and that they thought it was worthwhile to run for freedom, even though the chances of escaping were so slim. And of course, it was worth it. And Regina herself talked about even breathing in that camp as a Jewish person was an act of resistance. So I love to think of her knitting there and every stitch, this act of defiance almost. I'm still alive.
Exactly. I was thinking about our world today, our fast fashion and our hordes of clothes. And we don't think about how it was then for people who had meager means, who had to make a lot of their own clothes, had to make their own clothes. These garments were precious, even if they were to be worn in the everyday. A sweater, a very utilitarian article of clothing. But these things were also precious in that they were rare items. People didn't have closets full of clothes, drawers bursting with clothes. And I think about that idea and also the long process of knitting something like a sock a day.
It's a lovely point you're making that clothes, when you don't have a lot, they really matter, don't they? And I think with sweaters, we know that people would unravel the wool when the sweater was past its usable use and they would wash it and knit it up again because nothing could be wasted. I do think now still there are people who value hand knitting. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful craft activity and so creative and so incredibly clever mathematically, the things that people create with yarn now. So I think there is a renewed appreciation for it. But as you say, we tend to have so many clothes, we perhaps don't value the labor that goes into them and the resources as much as we should.
You are such a consummate researcher, and I'm thinking about how your research, and I'm sure it was years on, intersects now with the release of the book, also intersects now with here in the United States. I was reading a headline yesterday about anti-Semitism in the United States is so prevalent. I mean, it's staggering, the number of incidents of and hate crimes. And I'm wondering about how you encountered this idea in your research or in writing the book. And also, has there been anything that surprised you or intrigued you as you researched the book that you just were not expecting about this very same idea?
Two very interesting questions. I think it has been one of the, I suppose, demoralizing aspects of being a historian, particularly over the last 5, 10 years. I mean, anti-Semitism it's endemic, isn't it? It's ongoing. But to see things that I've researched and read about in history and to see those same patterns of behavior, the same hatred, the same demonizing of people, the same tribalism into us and them, it's very disturbing to see that play out not only in human nature, but also in a lot of political structures. And to think, oh, this isn't just from a specific time and place, say 1930s Germany or occupied Poland, that there really are people who are dedicated to spreading that hatred and to spreading the bigotry, to spreading the anti-Semitism. And of course, it's incredibly disturbing. And yeah, I have found that very, very difficult because if anything, this book, The Four Red Sweaters, it's saying no to all of that. It's saying, you have love and you have mass murder. Go for the love, the wonderful, the gifts, the generosity, the humanity, the compassion, the fun that we see in the four lives of these four girls. Don't be the people who are the perpetrators and the abusers and the enablers. So yeah, that was dispiriting. And in terms of your second question, what would be surprising? I think perhaps I've been very struck by how fond I became, if that's the right word, of all the people I researched, and particularly in researching the Heidenstein family. And perhaps there's a temptation with history to see it as something that happened a long time ago to other people. But actually, I felt fond of them, to discover who were these girls, what were their family, to go and visit where they'd lived, where they'd been to school. I came to the US to explore where Stella Heidenstein had worked and lived, going to Israel, going to Berlin, being in Poland. and to feel that sense of connection with people we don't know. That is so powerful. Strangers, these are complete strangers, but to humanize them and to realize how lucky we are, how many freedoms we have, and that we can build communities even with people we don't know.
Lucy Adlington, thank you so much for talking to me today about the 4 red sweaters.
Thank you so much.
Lucy Adlington is the author of 4 Red Sweaters, Powerful True Stories of Women and the Holocaust. Lucy Adlington is a British novelist and clothes historian with more than 20 years' experience researching social history and writing fiction and nonfiction. She's also the author of The Dressmakers of Auschwitz. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.